Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson, Michael Grumbine, and Dan Coates.
Welcome, everybody, to this brand new episode of Exploring Tolkien. I am Jonathan Watson. I'm here along with Michael Grumbine and Daniel of the Awesome Hat Coates. And I hope last week you enjoyed our little detour into the Tolkien Inquisition with Ted Naismith. That was a fun conversation, even though I don't know if you noticed it, but it was broken up into 2 weeks because the internet died for Ted in the middle of our conversation. And so I was going to say something about it, and then like, you know what, that edit actually worked out pretty well. So we just went with it.
Yeah, the second half was actually really fun.
Yeah, we really enjoyed that. It was great to have him on, and looking forward to his upcoming book of all his art, where he's actually said he's going to like even put in like some of his kindergarten art, like his early art is going to be in there. So
it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that'll be great. But this week we're back onto fairy stories, or as Tolkien wrote, on fairy stories. We're back on fairy stories, onto fairy stories. We're on fairy stories, guys. The third part, we'll see how far we get. But first, I want to, guys, that's a nice hat both of you are wearing. Tell me, where did you get that?
We got that from theonering.com.
Or shop.theonering.com, perchance. It's it is they're wearing hats that say "Make Tolkien Great Again." It's Tangmor. The
Tangmor is the script. Tangmor. Yeah, it's a script. It's the Elvish script, but it is the coolest hat ever because it is pretty much guaranteed. I'll do like when I was living in England, they have milk that it says virtually fat free. It doesn't say 99%; it just says virtually fat free. So you are virtually guaranteed to not have anyone understand your hat when you walk in. I'm going to test it out. I'm going to go to the airport tomorrow.
Awesome.
I don't know if the airport's a good place to. Maybe I should go to a bookstore or something.
No,
but
that's good.
Yeah, and I will. I'll go to a bookstore in an airport, and then we'll see. I'll walk around. But I don't think anyone in the history of this hat is ever going to know what it means, which is fantastic.
It's a good conversation starter. I've already had like 5 people ask me, "What is your hat?" And then I get to explain to them. And it ends up in a conversation of why the Rings of Power suck. So, it's great.
It is the natural end to all Tolkien conversations in 2023.
The Rings of Power was nominated for Emmys, by the way. Did you guys know that?
Yeah,
I think they're all technical Emmys. That's kind of like us getting nominated for our thumbnails. So.
Wait, there are thumbnail nominations?
Right? I know, right? That's kind of what it is. Like the content, guys, doesn't matter. But boy, that background that you have looks great. So I don't know. It's just funny.
Speaking of backgrounds, I'd like to point out that every single one of us has the Tower of Barad-dûr, other one, in our background. I don't know if there's any connection with this because we're talking about the origins of fairy stories, but hopefully not.
That's what we're saying. All right. Yes. So if you want that hat, go to shop.theonering.com. And there's a discount you can get if you become a member at theonering.com/members. And you'll also get our extended podcast where we talk a little bit more about the important things of life. Well, actually, the important things of Tolkien. Life doesn't really matter. It's all about Tolkien. And you get access to our Discord chat where you can ask questions, where you can converse with people. It's a little lighter now. I think everybody's on vacation, but there's still some interesting memes that are being tossed up every once in a while, which is a lot of fun to actually look at. So anyway, go to theonering.com/members to join us there. It's $4 a month. First month is free. So if you don't like it, move on, and we're okay with that. We appreciate that. All right. So Dan, I think we do have to start with this today.
Dan's Big Thought.
It's kind of a throwback to the long ago when we were reading through the Silmarillion, those many moons ago.
Like about last
3 weeks ago. Yeah, right. But Dan, you texted something to Michael and I, and we were both like, that might be it. So I think you should read that text to us, and as your big thought. I think it was clear enough.
Yeah. So reading through this part of the essay is on origins.
On origins, that's right. We're doing on origins, everybody. Yes.
Yeah, he's trying to say, what are the origins of fairy stories, right? And so my text message to you guys was, please tell us about the origins of fairy stories, Mr. Tolkien. Tolkien. No. And so it just kind of seems to be, you're reading through this essay and you're like, oh man, where does fairy stories come from? And he doesn't really seem to answer that question, I don't think.
Well, we're going to get into it. I agree with you. He definitely doesn't give a clear answer. I do think he gives us some. I mean, his answer is basically it can't be answered. That's his answer.
I think it comes from soup. I think that's what we're saying,
yes.
right?
Yes,
it's a soup.
A stew,
as it were.
And in honor of that, and a reference from this section, I also reread The Juniper Tree from the Brothers Grimm, which was awesome. I
don't know The Juniper Tree.
Oh, sorry. Boy. I'm gonna read you some selections from The Juniper Tree because Tolkien references it. But it is the dark that people criticize the Brothers Grimm for. And it is awesome. Horror. It's horror.
Well, so where do we start with this? Because if he doesn't define the origins of it, right? I think the word is where he defines it from what it isn't. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, although
the via negativa.
The via negativa. Where does that come from? You've said
that's that's Latin. It just means the way of the negative.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Just wondering if it was like Plato or anybody in the past said
it's philosophy. Yeah. It's okay. It's an Aristotle and Aquinas thing.
So what? So maybe we start with is there any way that Dan pointed out, reading it the first time, you're like, no, he doesn't actually say a fairy story is this. I think, again, it goes back to what we talked about the last time we went on fairy stories, is that he talks about the features of it, but he doesn't say what it is. It's kind of like saying it has ears, it has a trunk, it's got some pretty big legs, but he never says it's an elephant and comes from the jungles of Africa, right? He just kind of says what it is.
Yeah, and he starts out by talking about people that try to discover the origins of fairy stories. But he says basically they have a problem because he says they are the pursuits of folklorists or anthropologists, that is, of people using stories not as they were meant to be used, but as a quarry from which to dig evidence or information. So he's saying the people that try to figure out what the origins of fairy stories are like they're just trying to figure it out sort of without actually looking at the stories as they are. And presumably to what Tolkien means is we can learn something about what the origins of fairy stories are from looking at them as they were meant to be consumed, which is a very interesting idea, not just as an historical exercise, but as an historical exercise, he starts out by saying, here's what it's not. It's not just a few common stories that are all the same stories. So he says Beowulf is not a version of, I don't speak German, so
Erdmanneken. Sorry.
Mm. Yeah. Yep. Or the Black Bull of Norway and Beauty and the Beast, or the Norse Master Maid, and is the same as the tale of Jason and Medea. So he's saying, as is his wont, here's what it's not. It's not that Shakespeare's King Lear is not the same as Layamon's story in Brute or the Red Riding Hood. And he even says, interestingly, he gave an example, and this is one that I used with my children when we were talking about fairy stories, even the ones that didn't read this essay, as my high schoolers did, which is that the story of Red Riding Hood has been told and retold and softened and made more saccharine in the telling as it's been retold from its ancient past through Brothers Grimm and then on to what we now, Little Red Riding Hood story. And what I find interesting is that Tolkien says that, and I'll quote, the really important thing is that the later version, that is the later version of the story of Red Riding Hood, has a happy ending, more or less, and if we do not mourn the grandmother overmuch, and that Perrault's version had not, and that is a very profound difference to which I shall return. So what he's saying is basically these are two different stories, and what's funny is that the modern story of Red Riding Hood is that even the grandmother doesn't die. So right. In his time, you had Red Riding Hood, and they had sanitized it to the point where Red Riding Hood doesn't get eaten. She gets eaten by the wolf, but then gets cut out of the belly and is saved. In the modern version, both her and the grandmother get cut out of the wolf's belly and are saved. And so nobody gets eaten, and only the wolf dies. Or sometimes the wolf doesn't even die; he escapes and is driven off because violence is bad or something. So Tolkien's point is that though these retellings actually change it, they're actually not the same story. They're different stories. Why? Because their end is different.
Well, and I think he says that earlier in the line right above where he talks about King Lear. He says, "It is precisely the coloring, the atmosphere, the unclassifiable individual details of a story, and above all, the general purport that informs with life the undissected bones of the plot that really count." So the bones don't matter as much as everything that's on the bones.
The adjectives about it, exactly, all the details, but also the purport. And the purport, as the word, no doubt, people know, it's connected with the word purpose. The purpose of the story, which is why the old version in Tolkien's mind, the old version of Red Riding Hood is different, a different story from the new version, because its purpose is different, its ending is different. This is very Aristotelian. Aristotle said the most important cause of all the causes that you can look to when you analyze a subject is what he called the final cause, which is the purpose or the reason for an action that occurred. And for Tolkien, he's saying, I think, that is one of the most important reasons and attributes of the fairy story is the reason why it is, what is it trying to do, what is its purport.
So what is the purpose of Little Red Riding Hood then?
You mean the old one or the new one?
I guess either. I mean, what is their...
Or I could call the middle one now, since Tolkien was referring to as a middle one, and we now have a newer one. I mean, obviously, so you have an old version in which Red Riding Hood is naive and gets eaten.
Right.
So she doesn't follow her mother's advice, and she talks to the wolf, and then she's naive and gets eaten for her troubles. And so I think there's a lot of cautionary tale in the old one. The purpose of it is and a lot of the old fairy stories that were retold for children are cautionary tales,
like moral tales.
Well, and it's what not to do. Like, don't do this, right, or something bad's going to happen to you. But sometimes these old tales with horror, to lead us to another thing that he talks about, sometimes they are they're not about cautionary tales. The bad things that happen are not there to tell us why what not to do. They're there to actually just inspire a kind of horror. And in that regard, he references the stew. I'm going to build to this. So the stew, he says, is that this is what, if you want to know what the origin of fairy stories is, it's the same origin as a medieval stew pot, where basically they would throw everything in day after day, week after week, and have it on a slow boil, and would boil. It would be basically cooking for weeks on end sometimes, and it was and it would slowly change flavor, and things would get mixed together, and what you'd end up with is something different from what went in, and that's what he likens fairy stories to. The origin of fairy stories to is the stew pot of history and human thought, human language, and the meanings. Well, there's he gets to a very literal example of stew, which is used in the story of the juniper tree by the Brothers Grimm, and he uses that as an example of how a fairy story shows, from an origin perspective, the great distance and time that exists between the real origin of this kind of a story and what we have nowadays. So he says, and I'm jumping to the end of this section when I say this, and so I don't want to skip over everything, but just for reference, he says, "The beauty and the horror of the juniper tree, with its exquisite and tragic beginning, the abominable cannibal stew, the gruesome bones, the gay and vengeful bird spirit coming out of a mist that rose from the tree, has remained with me since childhood. And yet always the chief flavor of that tale," that's just such a bad pun, by the way, chief flavor. Such a great dad joke. I mean, like an great and awful dad joke. Yet always, because in this, by the main element of one of the primary elements of the juniper tree is that this boy gets killed by his stepmother and chopped up and turned into a stew, and then she feeds it to his dad unknowingly. Mm-hmm. And so it's a kind of Titus, like and the old tales of like a father consuming his children unknowingly, and he says, yet always the chief flavor of that tale lingering in the memory was not beauty or even horror, but distance and a great abyss of time, not measurable even by Tui Tu Son Jor. Without the stew in the
I think that means 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm. Without the stew in the bones, which children are now too often spared in mollified versions of Grimm, that vision would largely have been lost. I do not think I was harmed by the horror in the fairy tale setting, out of whatever dark beliefs and practices of the past it may have come. Such stories now have a mythical or totally unanalyzable effect, an effect quite independent of the findings of comparative folklore, and one which cannot spoil or explain. They open a door on capital O, capital T, other time. And if we pass through, though only for a moment, we stand outside our own time, outside time itself, maybe. I read the whole paragraph because I find this to be really key. Where he's showing us a real fairy story, a horrible one, a one that does, in most cases, inspire horror. It did in me when I reread it, because upon reading this, I then reread Juniper Tree. And yet he says what he's saying is that its primary purpose is to emphasize and transport us to an other time. So the elements in this story, the horror, the insanity, the wildness, the kind of joy, the weird, just the odd, the magic, magic, is something from another time, and we are put in that time when we reread it.
Right. It's hard for me to because so reading that whole thing, the one thing I get out of it is that one of the aspects of a fairy story is that it is in some ways ancient. And so that would then, of course, stand in opposition to what I said is, like, could Star Trek be a fairy story at some point? Probably, maybe not. Maybe that, like, he wouldn't consider some of those episodes of Star Trek to be like a fairy story. But distance is part of it too. So obviously great distance is part of it. And I think that goes into some things he says about children too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But it's not, like, it's such a broad stroke to say, this is part of what fairy story is, without giving it, he doesn't give it any boundaries, right? This still doesn't have any boundaries of, like, a great distance and abyss of time. Well, abyss of time is very, like, what is an abyss of time? An abyss of time to a 10-year-old is 25 years, right? And a great distance could be, like he points out in the children's chapter, a great distance to a child might be the house next door, whereas for us, it's the planet, a light years away, 8 light years, however far the Betelgeuse is and planets orbit. So I like Dan, I'm looking at this going like, no, there's no definition, guys. It's just like, these are some aspects of it right here.
He did say some things about myth resembling fairy story, or history resembling myth, and he's saying that they're both ultimately of the same stuff. That he's talking about this cauldron and stuff just is getting thrown in over time, over generations, and he's kind of saying, like, it kind of seems like he's saying, like, history and myth seem to be connected in some way. And then he's also something that jumped out to me was he was talking about myth and religion, and how perhaps, like, a long time ago they were severed or sundered, and maybe they're groping slowly back together. And then he says something very interesting to me, where maybe this gets to the point where he actually defines it, maybe in some way, maybe a small way. But it says fairy stories have 3 faces: the mystical toward the supernatural, the magical towards nature, and the mirror of scorn and pity towards men. The essential face is the middle one, the magical. I think that was interesting. Those, where he's kind of saying, it kind of seems like he's saying this stuff comes to us from the past. It's ancient, like you were saying, and it maybe even goes back to the very beginning of even religion too. And what is of the essence of it is that there's something magical about it. I don't know that I don't know if that sounds smart or not, but it jumped out to me like, oh, that's he's sort of getting at a definition there.
Yeah, and that sentence, I have it highlighted. That sentence jumped out at me too, because I spent a long time trying to figure out exactly what he was trying to say about fairy stories when it's three faces. So clearly they're clear definitions of something about fairy story, because the face can be easily recognized. The mystical towards the supernatural. What does that mean? Does that mean what is the relationship between the mystical and the supernatural? For instance, in The Lord of the Rings, the statement is often made that there is a supernatural. There's Eru and the Valar. You could say in some ways those are supernatural or ultra natural. But then there's the mystical aspect of it, and that would be like a Gandalf and the things that happen with that, or maybe how. Man, I don't even know. Like I'm trying to see, and so as I'm reading this, I'm trying to apply this to what he would say about the Lord of the Rings and the stories that we know that he told. And even that one phrase, I'm trying to figure out how it fits in with his fairy stories. So I don't know. Like, what do you guys think about? Like, what does that mean? The mystical towards the supernatural. I think the magical towards nature and the mirror of scorn and pity towards man is a little more easily definable. But the mystical towards the supernatural, that one struck me as I don't feel like I have a good answer to what he was trying to get at with that.
Yeah, I think you're almost there, actually, with the examples you gave from the Lord of the Rings. When I look at the Lord of the Rings, which is clearly intended to be a fairy story by him, and therefore will have those three elements that you mentioned, Dan, you see very clearly that the magical and the natural world are the focus of Lord of the Rings. But there's also the story of the corruption and fall of man, and the sadness, for example, of the fall of the men of Gondor. You know, when you hear Faramir talking about how great they were and what their history was, and all the hints of of what they could do in the past, and the grandeur, and then how far they've fallen. Mm-hmm. You see it in a funny way, even though I hated what he did, the fact that Peter Jackson made Aragorn doubt himself because of the weakness of men, and made Elrond harp on how weak and pathetic men are. Jackson, and I hated it because it wasn't in the books, but it's funny that Jackson latched onto that concept, because that is a very Tolkienian concept, that there is a weakness in men that does not exist in elves. Elves have their own weaknesses, and dwarves have their own weaknesses, but men do have a special proclivity to corruption that Morgoth and Sauron take advantage of. We read a lot about that. So there is that mirror of scorn that you said, that third element. So there's the magic, there's that. But when you ask the question, Jonathan, what are the mystical element towards the supernatural? Well, I mean, these are the prayers to Elbereth. This is the calling out to the Valar. This is Gandalf and his frequent speaking about this grander purpose and this purposer, who we know as a Iluvatar. Right. But they're hints. They're not the focus of the story. It's not intended to be the primary thing the story's about. But it nevertheless includes the mystical in it.
Yeah, and I guess the mystical towards the supernatural and the magical towards nature can kind of overlap at times, even in the sense that something mystical can seem magical, even though it may not be.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, we have been able to have the luxury of reading the Silmarillion at some length, and so we were able to go into depth about one of the interesting things about the elves, which is that they're bound to the world. Like, from a supernatural perspective, in a way, men are more supernatural than elves, because elves belong to the circle of Arda and this earth, and they keep returning to it, even though they have magic. Nevertheless, they're bound to fairy, to the land of fairy.
But I even think Tolkien would say their magic is like supernature. It is their nature.
That's right.
It's the magical perspective that we imbue it with.
But in the sense that the men leave the circles of the world, and
I get that. Yes, yeah,
and go to Iluvatar.
Yes, right.
They have a more supernatural end than the elves do.
Yeah.
So anyway, I like that you pointed that out, Dan, because I think he is giving us qualities, like Jonathan said in the beginning. He never answers the question, as you alluded to in your Dan's big thought. He never answers the question of what the origins are, but he does tell us more about what's involved in the origins. And he really clearly and over again links it to language. So he says that fairy stories are as old as language and probably as complex. and therefore almost impossible to pin down the true origins because they're as old as language. So, tell me the true origins of language if you can. And I know people take a stab at it. It's funny that his takedown of Max Mueller is awesome. So Max Mueller, he says Max Mueller's view of mythology as a, quote, disease of language can be abandoned without regret. He just dismisses the guy. Max Mueller was a very famous philologist, and his point was that Max Mueller thought that language came about and people had these abstract concepts like wisdom and justice. And then what they did was they turned those concepts into gods. And that's where we get mythology. Like mythology is just our stories about personalized wisdom and personalized wrath and personalized, beauty, etc. So interesting, but stupid. That's not actually, and anyone that studies mythology would know that that's not most mythology has, like, that's the quote unquote high mythology, but it's not most mythology. Most mythology has got nothing to do with such abstract concepts. They're just folklore stories that have been in that stew pot that Tolkien talks about over and over again. And so mythology is much broader and more interesting and kind of more visceral than this kind of idea that like mythology can be equated with Olympus and the gods that live in Olympus. Anyway, Max Mueller's easily dismissed. What I did find hilarious, though, I did see and I wanted to ask you guys about this idea that he has, a really cool idea, and then there's a hilarious part, or at least I found it hilarious, probably nobody else. The incantations of adjectives. Did you catch that part?
I have, yes, 100%.
Where it says favorite lines.
Yeah, it's awesome. So to read the line, it says, "But how powerful, how stimulating to the very faculty that produced it was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation in fairy is more potent." And he goes on to explain what he means, which is we can have green grass and it can delight, but then you can take the greenness away from the grass, and you can take that greenness and you can apply it to other things. And is this the first time he uses the word subcreation in this essay? Maybe he used it last time once.
I don't remember. He might have. He
says man becomes a subcreator when he's talking about the use of the adjective. So I think it's the first time when he talks about it, and he's going to lean into this concept quite a bit in the essay, is the subcreation idea. So man becomes a subcreator. So basically you're doing what God does, which is you're taking these abstract concepts, and because of the adjective, we can take them out of one thing and we can put them in another. And you can have a light mountain, light as in not heavy, mountain, and you can have pink grass, and you can have a terrible blue moon, or I like this one. He says, I think, because he's read Frankenstein. We may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. So you get, just by the addition of color into things, you can create a new story. So there's it's pretty cool.
I like the word that he used when he says we can take green from grass. And that's like an enchantment, right? It's sort of like that soup pot, except now it's a potion, and you're taking the green from the grass and sticking there, and you're taking the blue from the heaven and sticking there, and all of a sudden in a person's mind you've created something completely new and different that they hadn't experienced before, which at a young age, when reading this here, I didn't get that like this is an enchantment, the creation of something completely new. And then when you say something like cool green grass, like the feeling somebody gets, like it's not just, oh, it's cold and it's got this color. It's like, oh no, it's lying down in this grass on a cool night, right? You get this sort of feeling that you've created an enchantment outside of just those three words that might be different for different people, but it still is this creation of something completely new for every person.
Yeah, exactly. And he so speaking of his own work, he references, or what would become two of pieces from his work, although of course not exclusively his work, but he says, "We may cause woods to spring with silver leaves." So of course you think of Lothlorien with its gold and silver leaves. "Rams to wear fleeces of gold." Of course, Jason and the Argonauts, that Jason and the Golden Fleece story. "And put hot fire into the belly of the cold worm," which is the dragon, of course. So there's this power and magic that inheres in And for Tolkien, this has got to be like a core tenet, because he's a philologist and someone who creates fairy stories. So he loves the word, and so the power of the adjective. It's funny, when I was on my undergraduate in college, one of the things we had to read was Aristotle's categories, where Aristotle divides basically all aspects of existence into 10 categories of being. And one of the categories of being is quality. So Aristotle, it's an ancient Greek idea that there was an existence to qualities like green or hot, cold, light, heavy. They had an existence that was separate from the things in which they adhere. And so it's a really, really fascinating concept.
Dan, you were going to say something earlier when I cut you off.
Oh, that's okay. I love how he ends that paragraph that you're discussing with the power of the adjective. And like you said, it's like taking these things and combining them, and it's like you make something new. And he says, but in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made. It's almost like a godlike thing. You're making something new. Fairy begins, man becomes a sub-creator. And I thought that was kind of interesting. It seemed like the main point that he wanted to make with he was discussing the theories of what's the origin of fairy stories, and he talks about different theories of diffusion and independent evolution and invention. He talks about inheritance from common ancestry, like maybe these all go back to one common story. He talks about diffusion from various places at various times, but he says like ultimately they all come back to somebody had to invent this, somebody had to be a sub-creator. And that seems to be his main point, that somebody's sub-creating.
Yeah. So what he's doing there with the three terms you mentioned, invention, diffusion, and inheritance, is he's tapping into the 19th century scholarly mode, where when they were trying to discover the origins of something in history or in language, they would try to say, okay, well, what's its origin? Did someone just create it? Is it what we would call nowadays, is it really original, or did you just borrow it? Okay, so if is it original, in which case it's invention, or is it inheritance, like you got it from a long time ago and it's just a retold version of what was a long time ago, or is it diffusion, where it comes from different sources in place or around us, and you've combined them into something that is quote unquote new, but it's not really new, it's from these other sources. And like you said, Dan, invention is the most important. When it comes to fairy stories, the word for invention is subcreation. So that's the real, that's where the connection becomes between those scholarly concepts that he's referencing, because he's a scholar. He has to speak the language of his peers when he's when he's writing an essay like this. So he's connecting their ideas and methodology to his new idea, which is subcreation.
So when we're talking about subcreation, I just had this thought. It's not just creating a story. Subcreation is creating a world. It's like you are creating a whole nother parallel universe. Like maybe maybe Chesterton would say Elfland.
Yes.
Tolkien might say fairy. But it's creating a whole nother universe that man is entering into.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And he's going to go more into that in the next section on the section called Children, but it's really about a third of his questions that he's going to answer, which is what's the purpose of fairy stories. So right now we're talking about the origins, but he's going to go into what the purpose of them is.
So thank you, Dan, for that. That clarified some things. So I see three things that fairy stories are now. One is ancient, either through a distance or abyss of time, is the way he put it. Two, it creates a world. It takes the green from grass, so to speak, and it creates something new for those who are, believing in it. And I think it. Anyway, I'm gonna. In the next chapter, he talks about how even a big fan of cricket is sort of living in a sub-created world, and we can talk about that later. But I love that little analogy that he made. Like he's so awesome. Into it, like he's experiencing something completely different than the person next to him is experiencing, who's not into it. And three, it has to have a purpose. Is that right? Is there like purpose, or I don't know if that's the right word for it.
I think it's right. No, it has to have a purpose. The hard part is deciding what the purpose is sometimes. Yeah. And because because the method by which fairy stories come to us is a stew pot. Therefore, the purpose can be multifaceted. You can actually have multiple purposes, because it wasn't like the people that did the subcreation at various points in the fairy story throughout the centuries, when wasn't like they all had the exact same purpose all the time. It's a more organic process than that. It adds things to itself, and it aggregates ideas. And so what we have at any given moment, the fairy story we have in front of us, could in fact contain all kinds of purposes. Tolkien's fairy story is different. And he would say this, I think he would say this. I think this is a natural consequence of what he's telling us. He's talking here about the origin of fairy stories in general as a phenomenon. But purposeful subcreation at a single moment in time, like Tolkien did with his whole world, that's something a little different, because while he definitely took elements from other fairy stories and myth and history, so he did the stew pot thing. Nevertheless, he's a single author of Middle Earth. He is the author of Middle Earth. I don't think, and if he did say this, I would disagree with him if he was to say that.
You're not allowed to do that. Are you serious?
Yeah.
You're not
Sorry,
allowed.
dude.
No.
I just I'm wearing the hat just because he was cool with languages. No, but if he were to say, which I don't think he would, but if he were to say that he wasn't that there were purposes in his story from other places and times that he didn't, and that he wasn't in some sense really the author and the purposer. I think in a case like a fantasy novel, if it's well done, it's an actual fairy story, and Tolkien's is, of course, then there is, in fact, you can tease out the full purposes. I don't think you can tease out the full purposes of a story like Red Riding Hood, because it's a stew pot effect of so many others. You could tease out some, but you could never get to the point where you're like, yep, and that's it. That's the purpose of this story. I just think Tolkien would say it's too. There's too many flavors. There's too many bits and pieces of bone and meat and different things in the stew pot. Some of which you don't want to touch, and some of which are delicious.
Yeah. Well, I like that, guys. I think this has clarified a lot for me, like when it comes after reading it. Those three things, I'm going to try and highlight that. And the whole idea of the distance and a great abyss of time, just real fast. I think in our extended podcast, because I think we're going to close this out early and we're going to go into the children's chapter next for next week. But the idea of a fairy story needs a distance and a great abyss of time, and when you draw the real world closer to the fairy story in that distance, whether by your writing and adding modern colloquialisms into it, it minimizes the effectiveness of that fairy story. Does that make sense? So when you have people in the Rings of Power say, okay, that's you, like even that little small word doesn't resonate with where it's supposed to be or when it's supposed to be. Anyway, just a thought about that. I
like it.
Maybe we can get into the extended podcast. We can talk about like why are things like what did the Rings of Power get wrong in fairy story? What did even Peter Jackson get wrong about fairy story? And kind of muse on that a little bit, knowing, like, talking about the things that we see now and here.
And I have a comment, a Rings of Power comment about that, but we will talk about it in the extended podcast, because it has to do with the adjective as incantation and how the people that write Rings of Power don't understand that, and what they do something that Tolkien would be kind of mortal sin in the writing of fairy stories. But anyway, we'll get into that.
All right. Well, let's close this origins down. I'm gonna say again those three things like that are important to even focus on. And I don't know if those are the only three things, but three things that I took out of it. And again, you guys can all disagree with me because hey, we're reading something and trying to figure out as we go. It has to be ancient and have a distance and a great abyss of time, or ancient is another word. It creates a world. It uses adjectives in that way and creates something new that we believe and we experience as sub-created universes, places. It doesn't have to be a whole universe, but a place, and it has to have a purpose of some sort that is definable. It can't be nihilistic.
Yeah, I like that. Maybe we'll get into banana peels too in the extended podcast because that was funny.
But yeah, a quote about banana peels
and the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yes. All right. So,
but it has to be magical as well.
It has to be magical. Yes, right. Those three things you mentioned too. The mystical towards the supernatural, magical towards nature, and the mirror of scorn and pity towards men. But yes, the magical part, right? And the magical part of that is like using those adjectives magically. I feel like creating something that you wouldn't, like a light mountain, like you said, Michael. That's something that we wouldn't go and look at a mountain and go, that looks really light. But when you say a light mountain, you start within the context of whatever way that's written, right? That creates something new that you might not have experienced just looking at a mountain out your window, something like that. So, all right, Michael, today you have the privilege, I guess, of doing.
If you like Tolkien.
All right. So if you like Tolkien, I like this for two reasons. What we have here, if you like Tolkien, you will like, I think, Tolkien's Beowulf translation and commentary. Now, this version that I have here, which is really cool, also has Selic spell at the end of it, which is cool, and I'll talk about that in a second. But basically, as most people who like Tolkien know, Tolkien taught Beowulf in his Anglo-Saxon language and a literary course at Oxford, and he would famously come into class in the first day of classes chanting Beowulf and basically chanting the first essentially 4 pages of Beowulf in Anglo-Saxon, and which is awesome. But interestingly, what we often forget who love Tolkien's secondary world is that Tolkien was a first-rate scholar, and not only a first-rate scholar, but his translation of Beowulf is actually regarded as one of the top 2 scholarly translations in the world right now of Beowulf, still 100 years later, or almost 100 years later. And so, go ahead.
Is the other one the Seamus Heaney one? Have you read that one?
Might be,
yeah. I have that one too. I've read that one.
That sounds familiar. And so he had never intended. He didn't publish this. This is Christopher Tolkien's work, just taking his father's class notes and the translation. His father had a translation of Beowulf, and publishing it. So Christopher did this. And then the final note I'll say, if you like Tolkien, is it has this really cool thing. This version has a really cool thing at the end called Selic spell, where Tolkien does this awesome thing, very much related to what we've just been reading about on fairy stories. And I'm going to read what Christopher Tolkien says. Basically, there's only one general statement that by my father about his work Selic spell that I have found. And it is the following very rushed note in pencil, difficult to read. And so I'm going to read you just one section of Tolkien's note about his own story. Selic spell is actually a recreation of Beowulf. So Tolkien, and this is Tolkien, this version is a story, not the story. It is only to a limited extent an attempt to reconstruct the Anglo-Saxon tale that lies behind the folk tale element in Beowulf. And then he goes on and he says, of course, we do not know what precisely was the style and tone of these lost Old English things. I have given my tale a northern cast of expression by putting it first into Old English. And by making it timeless, I have followed a common habit of folk tales as received. So he's referencing the process that we just read about on fairy stories and the origins of fairy stories, which is that people would take these tales and they would retell them, and it would go into the stew pot. And so he's saying, what might Beowulf have been like if it in the era before the one that we know about, if it was this proto tale of Beowulf, and what might the elements be? And so he writes a shortened version of the Beowulf story in Old English, in Selic spell, which Selic spell itself is a quote from a line in Beowulf. And a Selic spell, yep, go ahead.
It means wondrous tale. I had to look
Yes,
that up.
exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, check it out.
It's like he's,
like
he's dipping his ladle into the soup of Beowulf and pulling out a slightly different story.
Exactly. And don't look too closely at the bones sticking out.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
That was another thing in this chapter too, where he said spell means both the story told and the formula of power over living men.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is so critical because we think of spell as an incantation. It's that second meaning of spell that we emphasize nowadays. He's pointing out, hey, that's not wrong, but it's connected to this older idea of this wondrous tale told. So if you can tell a wondrous tale, you have told a spell, and it
You have
binds
cast
men.
a spell over the
You
audience.
have cast a
right?
spell, and you can bind men's hearts. That's right.
Man. Okay. Well, guys, all right, we're going to jump into our extended podcast. But first, hey, if you enjoyed what you're hearing, please give us a review on iPods. Wow. Apple Music. I don't know. What are we doing here? Apple
What are kids doing these days? Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
2004 called Jonathan. It
That's
wants
right.
its meme
Apple
back.
Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, everywhere you listen. That would be great. We really appreciate it. And if you want to hear more, hear our extended podcast this week, get in our Discord chat. As usual, please go to theonering.com/members, become a member. First month is free. It's just $4 a month. Or if you want to do more like Harrison and Adam and Lynn and Chuck, there are sponsors who give a little bit more in order to support us and the costs associated with this. And we really appreciate them all. So let's jump into our extended podcast, guys. We're going to talk about the extended or the Rings of Power, Peter Jackson and banana peels. That'll be fun. We'll see where it goes. Oh, and Michael, what do you usually say?
Goodbye, freeloaders.
Okay, so I got a note from somebody that said, they listen to the whole podcast, and the last thing that they hear is "goodbye, freeloaders." It's a little bit of an affront to the person who's listening the whole time. I think it was said in jest, but we appreciate all you freeloaders, all you people who listen through the whole way. Definitely, the bread and butter here of the listener group, and we appreciate that bread and butter, meaning like not the full sandwich, just the bread and the butter. Like we're not. Am I digging myself into a deeper hole here now?
The stew pot. You're throwing yourself in a deeper stew pot.
All right, bye, y'all. We're just going to go to our extended podcast before this hole gets any deeper and I reach China.